is a really important lesson for how we can make change and fight back against this corporate education reform onslaught. I want to say a couple words about why the tests are racist, where they come from, and some of the history of it before I wrap up on some notes about how we're going to resist this problem. And I want to talk about the ways in which these tests reproduce institutional racism. There's a lot of ways in which the tests are racist, and destroy our kids. They ignore multiple intelligences, right? They're very narrow of what they measure. I mean, this is something that affects all the kids, but when you bubble in A on the test, what does that tell me about what you know? Could tell me you guessed right, and you had no idea what the answer was. It could tell me that you knew the answer, but you kind of doubted yourself and you thought another one was right. If you got it wrong, it could tell me, maybe you knew the right answer and doubted yourself at the last minute. Maybe you had a more sophisticated thought process and you saw that there could be multiple ways to see this question. It actually hides more than it reveals about the thought process, right? And of course we know these tests favor kids with more resources, right? So if you can buy test prep, materials, or tutoring, obviously those kids end up scoring better. And there's some specific ways we've seen these tests be institutionally racist in Seattle. The SBAC test, the Smarter Balance test that's tied to the Common Core standards, provides glossaries for English language learners so they can look up the words they don't know to be able to understand the test they're taking, except for there were no glossaries in any African language. So all of our Ethiopian students, Eritrean students, right? Oh, too bad. But this is the new civil rights movement, don't forget. We've seen so many culturally biased test questions. There was a test question on the Smarter Balance test that somebody told me about. I didn't see myself, but somebody told me about this year that was about a soldier in the Confederate Army. And after reading this passage about this soldier in the Confederate Army, you had to decide whether they were brave, they had ingenuity, right? You had to this was the ABC, right? There's to questions.
Was traitor one of the possibilities?
Right. Right. Was bloodthirsty, murderous, racist one of the options? No. No, it wasn't. And then I want to talk about the construction of the tests. How do they decide what questions to put on the test and what to leave out? I mean, we've caught a glimpse of this in some of the writing that's been done about the SAT exam. So what they do is when students take the SAT, they embed questions in the test that they don't actually count on your score. Okay? And these are sample questions that they are vetting to see if they're valid and reliable test questions that they can use on future exams that they're producing. Right? And so students take these questions, and then the questions that lots of kids do well on, they throw those out. So if it has a high percentage of kids scoring, getting the question right, then it's not deemed to be valid and reliable to get a nice bell curve, right, of a few kids doing well, most of the kids in the middle, and few kids failing, right? So if they get that kind of distribution on a test question, then they say this is a good test question. Well, why would they get a good bell curve? If a lot of kids are doing well, it's probably because more students of color, more low-income students are getting that question right. So that question is then thrown out. it's deemed not valid. That is the way institutional racism is embedded in the very logic of the construction of the test. Right? And it's really about reinforcing this meritocracy in our society. These tests are about convincing society that you're in your right place. You're in your low-wage job because you didn't do well on these tests, and you know it's about convincing you that you deserve your place in society. And those people who are sending us off to die in wars, those people who are robbing us blind with bailing out banks, those people are probably there because they're smarter than us and did what better in school, right? And really, the scores are then used to punish kids, denying them graduation, denying them promotion, denying them access to the higher level classes, shutting their schools down. We saw in Chicago and Philadelphia, the biggest places, but in Seattle and all across the country, the schools, the DC, right? The school, it's not random which schools they close down, right? They pick the ones that they can say are failing, are underachieving based on the fact that they have starved them of resources, of money, and then labeled and registered that quote-unquote failure with their racist tests, and then they shut the schools down and destabilize the community, right? And then there's more violence in the community, and then they send the police in to deal with it, right? But I think that the most damning evidence of all about the fact that these tests are designed to maintain institutional racism is to go to the origin of who first made these tests, of where they came from. Today, every last corporate ed reformer tells you this is about more testing in school, is about closing the achievement gap, and it's the civil rights movement. But back in the day, the people who invented these tests were open eugenicists, right? This fake pseudoscience of open white supremacists who, right, believed that they could scientifically prove white supremacy. Not just white supremacy, but male supremacy, native-born supremacy over immigrants. They broke it down to like the northern Nordic white people were really the intelligent one, and the swarthy Mediterraneans, well, they were under, right? This is what eugenics was all about. And this is the people that first invented these tests. There's a man named Carl Brigham who was a professor at Princeton University. He actually got a job with the Army during World War I, and he developed the alpha and beta tests, which were some of the first mass use of standardized testing in the United States. And the alpha test was written tests. It was multiple choice, but it was written with words, and the beta test was pictures, multiple choice with pictures for people who were illiterate. Black people had to take the beta test regardless if they were literate or not. Right. But it was given to the conscripts in the war.
What was his name?
Carl Brigham. Okay? And they administered it to millions of, over 1 million soldiers coming in. The idea was they wanted to figure out who was officer material to oversee the war, and then who was going to be just the cannon fodder to die in the trenches. Okay? So then, after he develops the alpha and beta tests, and he uses it to demonstrate his belief in white supremacy and the supremacy of men and rich people, he then goes back to Princeton and says, you know, I've got some really reliable data that shows these standardized tests can demonstrate intelligence. And he turned the alpha beta test into the SAT test, right? That's what we send all our young people to go to take now. You know, it's different than it was then, but it's the same A, B, C, D multiple choice exam that was created by the man who wrote the book called A Study in American Intelligence, which is like the Bible of the eugenics movement. That book, Turn to the Life, I don't recommend buying it and reading it necessarily, but if you do, turn to the last page of the book and read the final paragraph that says why American intelligence is going to decline because we have more black people in this country than Europe does, and that, you know, intermingling is going to bring down the intelligence of America, right? Those are the founders of standardized testing in this country. That's what the so-called education civil rights movement of the corporate reformers is based on. And because of that history, it shouldn't surprise you that some of the first test resistors were black intellectuals, right? Today we hear opt out so white. Have you guys seen the hashtag opt out so white? Because the last thing the corporate reformers have to hang on to is that these tests, you know, there's this mass opt out revolt, but really it's just white middle class moms that are, you know, as Arnie Duncan put it, afraid that their kids aren't as smart as they thought they were, right? And it's so condescending, as if white middle class moms don't have a right to make their kids more than a score, right? I mean, it's so condescending to white middle class moms, and it also is used to completely erase me and my family and black families all across and Latino families all across the country that are leading this movement. And it also erases the history of the fact that this movement really stands on the shoulders of giants and you know, a black movement that first challenged these racist nature of these tests. So there's a long list. There was Horace Mann Bond, Howard Long, W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP, was one of the first most outspoken critics of the use of these tests. He wrote in 1940, quote, "It was not until I was long out of school, and indeed after the First World War, that there came the hurried use of the new technique of psychological tests, which were quickly adjusted so as to put black folk absolutely beyond the possibility of civilization." And now we're seeing these tests.
It's in his book.
Yep.
It's in his book. I just overlooked that.
Yeah.
Yes.
You should check it out. I have it sourced. I have it sourced. I have the source in my book, More Than a Score, or you can Google it online and get it. But there's a whole bunch more written. I mean, there's some great stuff that I recently came across in the 60s and 70s where Charles Hamilton, who co-wrote Black Power with Stokely Carmichael, wrote some incredible passages about the way standardized testing was used. You have students at San Francisco, the largest student strike, one of the first to fight for black studies, talking about the way these tests were used to shut out black students from campuses. Some incredible stuff from the 60s and 70s as well. And I just want to talk about how these tests reinforce the school-to-prison pipeline before before I wrap up and talk about strategies for resistance. But, you know, I think the school-to-prison pipeline starts with that textbook that Kobe was reading that erases the word slaves and puts the word worker. It starts with kids not seeing their culture reflected in the curriculum, not seeing school as a way to empower them, and then they check out and they're not interested and they're not paying attention in class, and then that gets labeled as opposition or defiance, but I see it as resistance to racism.
Exactly.
Right? And then what happens when they resist by not paying attention? There's zero tolerance discipline policies that were taken straight out of the drug enforcement manuals and put onto school policy programs, as Michelle Alexander writes about. And so now the zero tolerance discipline means that they have to be suspended. And then what happens when they're suspended? They're not in class, they don't pass the class, they don't graduate, then they can't get a job, then they end up doing crime, then they end up getting put into the prison cell where we're spending more to incarcerate them than to educate them.
Exactly.
Okay? And then a study came out of Boston University recently that shows the only measurable outcome of using high-stakes testing as an exit jam requirement for graduation was increased incarceration rates. It didn't get kids better jobs, better wages. The only thing they could find that it increased was incarceration rates. Okay, that's the new civil rights movement for these corporate education reformers. And I think increasingly we have to go beyond a school-to-prison pipeline and start talking about a school-to-grave pipeline.
Wow.
When you look at what happened to Tamir Rice, who was shot down in 1.3 seconds of the police coming up on the park, right? A 12-year-old boy. When you look at what happened to the 7-year-old girl, where was that? Tiana, who remembers that story? She was shot, a bullet through the window that shot her while she was sleeping. When you look at Michael Brown, who was getting ready to go to college, he had just graduated from high school and then shot down in the streets at the age of 18. Jordan Davis, 17, shot for playing his music too loud. This is really a school-to-grave pipeline that's being implemented in our school systems across the country. Right?
The only reason Trayvon was in Sanford was he was suspended for an infraction that the white children in that school are never suspended for.
That's
he was
yes,
suspended,
thank
he was
you.
up there on punishment.
Thank
Had
you.
he not been suspended, he never would have been encountering Zimmerman.
Thank you. Exactly. You see, that's what the school-to-grave pipeline I'm talking about. And think about the testimony that Darren Wilson gave when he was indicted, when they were on trial to see if he would be indicted, right? And of course he wasn't indicted or held guilty for the murder of Michael Brown. You guys remember hearing him say this Hulk came after him? This demon came after him? Not this human being, this young boy. Right? How do you dehumanize someone like that to be able to shoot them down in the streets? Part of it is this media culture that talks about thugs, talks about our children as thugs, right? And drug dealers and gangsters, right? That allows people to dehumanize them. But I think part of it is also this media culture that talks about our young people as failures.
Yeah.
And labels them with the test score, and that test score being used to dehumanize. So we're not shooting down young black people in the streets, we're shooting down failures who are never going to amount to anything anyway, so why not? That's the school-to-grave pipeline, and I think that's why it's desperate and urgent that we unite a Black Lives Matter movement with the opt-out movement, with the movement against corporate ed reform. And I'll just end by saying I think that our society is in deep crisis. We have the highest level of income inequality in U.S. history. There are 65 people in this world that have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people. The other half of the planet, 65 people, are hoarding all the wealth that could be used to meet our healthcare needs, that could house and clothe and feed everybody. Right? We have a social catastrophe of mass incarceration where you have more black people behind bars than were slaves on plantations in 1850. We have an epidemic of violence against women, where you have 1 in 4 women reporting having faced sexual assault, and it's off the charts on college campuses that goes unchecked with just this rape culture that flourishes and this objectification of women in the media that reinforces that. You have attacks on LGBTQ community and, you know, this nonsense of these bathroom bills. We have endless wars in our society where we're using more money to destroy people and bomb children in the Middle East than we're using to build schools right here in D.C. and across the country. Right? We have a climate change catastrophe that's perhaps the most scary, because that's the one that really we're on a time limit to solve.
Exactly.
Right? Scientists say if the global temperature increases by 3 degrees, that it will trigger runaway climate change, and that is irreversible.
Yeah.
And if that happens, then the planet will no longer sustain human life. And then civilization comes to an end, and humanity comes to an end as we know. Right? Those are the real high stakes. And none of those problems can be solved by bubbling in A, B, C, or D on a standardized test, right? It's desperate that we figure out how to build social movements to challenge those problems, that we teach critical thinking in our schools, that we teach kids how to collaborate and work together, that we teach civic courage in our classrooms and in the streets and in the movements, to challenge those problems if we are going to build the movements that we so desperately need to solve those social catastrophes. And so I hope that we can use this session to strategize about how to build those movements. Thank you all. I don't know how much time I used or how much time we have left. So does someone know more than me? What's the program say?
2:30. 3:45.
So like 3:20.
Okay, so we have till 3:45?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I used a little too much time, but let's, yeah.
So when are all y'all in Seattle gonna be walking out on SBAC?
So the fight against SBAC was incredible. Last year we had several schools at 100% opt-out. So we had Nathan Hale had 100% opt-out. The center school had 100% opt-out. Nova had 100% opt-out. At Garfield, we were organizing to figure out are we gonna do another boycott of SBAC? And we were holding our meeting to figure it out, and the testing coordinator came in with the opt-out figures. We had 95% opt-out of the test. The opt-out was so high that we didn't have to administer the test anymore because there was only a handful of students taking it. So we successfully last year defeated the test altogether at Garfield. This year, the high stakes came online with the graduation, right? So if we refused to give it, the kids wouldn't graduate. So that then, would put us on the wrong side of the families and the students. So now we did some things. We organized an opt-out bus that came to Garfield and distributed flyers about students' rights, and we had some opt-out, but not the students who had to graduate in very large numbers. And it means we have to up the scale of the movement. We have to find new ways to resist and fight back and attack other tests that don't have the graduation requirement.